I am the Ascended Master Astrea, Elohim of the fourth ray, often called the ray of purity, but also the ray of acceleration. So naturally, building on Saint Germain's discourse, we need to accelerate democracies. We need to accelerate the sense of what is the responsibility of a democratic government and a governmental apparatus. What is actually the responsibility of a democratic society as a whole? Well, my beloved, let us go back and look at history, and you can go back to different eras and see that there have been eras of almost complete chaos, where there was no rule of law, and where the people never knew when they might be attacked by an outside enemy, and their lives might be destroyed in an instant. You may ask yourselves today why people so willingly submitted to the Catholic Church, to the feudal system, to the kings of the Middle Ages. But you can barely understand in the modern Western world that these people have for a long time lived in societies where the ordinary person had very little protection against either bands of robbers or even bigger invasions from various forces. And so they gave up their freedom in order to be protected and have the kind of stability that you after all did have in many periods. There were of course also periods where neither the church nor the feudal lords could guarantee people's safety, but people still thought that the safety was so important that they saw no other option than submitting themselves to the elite. This, of course, is something we have transcended with democracy, but my aim is to show you that there have been different stages in the evolution of society. And so you can go back to a point where the main issue was physical protection, physical survival. Then you can see that beginning with the Industrial Revolution and forward, it was not so much physical survival or physical protection, it was more actually having the material needs fulfilled. Those who are beyond the need for protection and survival. And so what you naturally see is that now many of the more affluent, many of the older democracies have reached a new stage. But they have not become aware that they have reached that new stage. And that is why the democratic governments are not living up to their responsibility towards their citizens. And so you can, if you employ the pyramid of needs defined by Maslow, you can see that the highest of all needs is the need for self-actualization. But we could also say in a more universal way that there are many people in democratic nations who are not quite ready for self-actualization, but they are ready to step up to a level that is beyond this quest for material affluence and security. Many of you can go back to your parents' or grandparents' generation who lived in the difficult years during the 1930s or during the Second World War, and you will see that for them, poverty was such an issue that the main vision and dream they had in life was to have enough food, have a place to live, and even have money left over to do something more enjoyable. This need in many nations gradually became fulfilled during the 50s and 60s, and then people went into desiring not only the necessities of life fulfilled, but having more affluence so they could also have a certain luxury of material goods. Again, this can be seen as a natural stage. But now, in many of the older democracies, people have had such affluence for so long that they begin to take it for granted. And when the people begin to take something for granted, it is no longer promoting growth. It is no longer helping them raise the collective consciousness. On the contrary, it can actually cause a raising of the collective consciousness in the sense that when people take something for granted, they go into a blind alley in their spiritual growth, and they are no longer appreciating what they have. And if you do not appreciate what you have, you cannot actually multiply it. That is, in fact, one of the reasons why in some of these nations you have seen the economy starting to contract. And it is again because people are simply not appreciating it, and they are not willing to step up to the next level, so there cannot be an acceleration. And so when you have the knowledge that you are not going to be killed by some war or invasion by barbarian tribes, or when you have your material needs fulfilled, or even when you have enough money to buy various kinds of luxuries, what is the next step up? Well, ultimately it is self-actualization, but many people have to go through a phase before that because they're not quite ready in consciously engaging in a spiritual path of systematically and consciously raising their consciousness. So the intermediate stage that, in universal terms, people are ready to lock into is that the next natural step is that people come to feel good about themselves. Not about their outer situation or their society, but they're about themselves as an individual, as a conscious being. This is something that many, many people are ready to see. It is very simply that we have now been focused on material welfare for decades, and the next natural step in the evolution of democracy is that we focus on psychological welfare. We have talked about it before, but I wish to go even further with this topic. What will it take then to promote psychological mental welfare among the people in a free democratic nation who have more material affluence than they actually know what to do with? Well, it will take, as Saint Germain also mentioned, that you begin a discussion of what kind of beings you actually are. But more than that, it will actually take that people begin to question the approach that we have had so far to understanding reality, understanding the universe, understanding ourselves. Now I know that most people are not familiar with philosophy, so I wish to give you a very quick course, crash course in Western philosophy. Most of you know that about 2,500 years ago, there were some philosophers in Greece, in Athens. You have probably heard about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. But what most of you don't know, because very few people actually realize this, even most philosophy professors, is that the two main philosophers of the Greek era, Plato and Aristotle, actually represent two different approaches. I'm not trying to say here that one was completely in alignment with the Ascended Masters, and one was completely out of alignment. But nevertheless, the approach and the main philosophy of Plato was that beyond the material universe is a realm where there exists ideal forms. And these ideal forms are what have manifested all of the physical forms we see at this level. You will see, of course, that this is quite similar to what we have taught you, only we have gone into more detail, that there are 4 levels of the material universe, and that the conditions you see at the physical level are actually created at the three higher levels: identity, mental, emotional. And so Plato was open to the existence of a realm beyond, and his main approach to philosophy was that if we wanted to understand the physical world, we had to understand the realm of ideal forms and how they had manifested the forms we see in the physical. His own student, Aristotle, took philosophy in a different direction by focusing on the material world and actually saying that it should be possible to explain and understand everything in the material world by only looking at the material world. It was not necessary to look beyond to some realm that we could not directly perceive with our senses. Aristotle thought that we can understand the world through what we can see or perceive through the senses. Plato said that the soul comes into embodiment with certain knowledge and ideas into it. Aristotle said that the soul is a blank slate, and as the child grows and receives sensory impressions, then the soul starts gaining content. Again, you can see that Plato obviously was more in alignment with Ascended Master teachings about reincarnation, and that the soul already comes in with much knowledge and psychological patterns from past lives. And so, naturally, for many, many years, even centuries, the Greek philosophers had relatively little influence on the rest of the world. There was even a time where they were forcefully suppressed by the Catholic Church because it was seen as incompatible with Christianity. But then there came a point where a philosopher, Thomas Aquinas, started to study Aristotle and created a new philosophical system where he sought to unify Aristotle and Catholic Christianity. And this then brought the awareness of Aristotle to the Western world, and when scientists began to have conflict with religion, then the people who took over science and set the stage for scientific philosophy, they built on Aristotle and the idea that you can understand the material world by looking only at the material world. And so the very foundation for science since then has been precisely this: to study only the material world and to actually believe that it is possible to come up with what they call a theory of everything, where you find some material condition that can explain everything that is happening in the universe. This, my beloved, is a philosophical and scientific blind alley. And there are many, many people in embodiment who are actually ready to see this, to awaken from this illusion. Just like you see in the fairy tale, where they all believed the emperor was wearing these fanciful clothes until the little boy cried out, "But the emperor has nothing on." And so, the emperors of scientific materialism truly have nothing on. And this becomes very, very clear when you realize a very simple fact. The focus on material welfare has not automatically brought psychological welfare. No matter how much material affluence people have, it does not automatically make them feel good about themselves. It does not automatically make them happy. And so you can see then that if you are a truly responsible democratic society, if you want to do what is best for your own citizens, you need to step up to where you can focus on psychological welfare and helping all people feel good about themselves. This is not some far-flung spiritual goal about reaching higher states of consciousness. It is quite universal for people to realize that why shouldn't people feel good about themselves? Then you can, of course, look at the fact that in most of the affluent democracies, there has been an increase in the frequency of mental illness. Many people are unhappy, many people are dissatisfied. In fact, it seems like the more affluence people get, the more dissatisfied they become. And you can start just simply asking why this is so. And therefore you can recognize a very simple fact, that people are not material beings. If they were, then once they had the affluent material conditions, they should automatically be happy and feel good about themselves. The very fact that the affluence materially does not lead to them feeling good shows that they have needs. People have needs that are not material. And this then leads to the recognition that human beings are conscious beings, and that how you feel about yourself, whether you are happy or not, is determined by consciousness. You will see that as there has been a rise in mental illness or depression or unhappiness, pharmaceutical companies have been frantically trying to create this wonder drug where you just take a pill and then you are happy. But they have not been able to come up with one, and more healthcare professionals are beginning to realize that we cannot use drugs to overcome mental illness and the rise in mental illness. And so this shows you that there is no material mechanism in the physical body that guarantees that you feel good about yourself, because feeling good about yourself is a condition that exists in consciousness and therefore must be brought about at the level of your consciousness, not at the level of your physical body. This can lead on to a critical examination of another platform, another principle brought out by Aristotle and adopted by materialistic science. It is simply this: everything in the world can be broken down into smaller, more basic components. If we understand the basic components out of which a thing is made, then we can understand the thing. In other words, for every whole, this whole is made up of smaller components. If we understand those components and how they work, then we can understand the whole. This is why scientists have been studying the physical brain in order to find out how the human psyche works. They think that consciousness is produced by the brain has smaller components. If we find out how those components work, then we must understand how consciousness works and what makes people happy and what doesn't. And so it is not a big leap to take this experience that you have and realize that the very fact that people are not happy proves that you cannot understand a human being by looking at the material components in the brain. And you can expand this to recognize that you actually can never understand a whole by looking only at the individual smaller components. You cannot understand the entire universe by looking at atoms and subatomic particles. There is no smallest possible particle that you can find that will allow you to understand the totality of the universe, because the universe is a whole. Now, my beloved, where does a whole exist? It exists only in consciousness. You can look at all of the cells, all of the neurons, all of the connections in the physical brain of a human being. But they will not in themselves make up the totality, the whole of a person. You can look at all of the components of the universe, and they do not make up the totality of the universe. Therefore, it is very, very realistic, and it is a very small switch for people to actually realize that our attempt to understand the whole by looking only at the components is flawed from the beginning. It will never take us to understand the whole. We need to step up and look at the whole, and we can do this because we are conscious beings. We have the capacity of consciousness to understand the whole, but we cannot do this through the current scientific methods. We cannot do this through the analytical, intellectual mind, which is designed to look at the details and categorize the details and organize the details. But in the process of doing so, the analytical mind loses the whole. We can only look at the whole through what is popularly called intuition, but which is actually a much more multifaceted ability. It is ultimately what we have said, the conscious use ability to step outside of the four lower bodies and look at the world from a different perspective. But the essence of the conscious you, as we have described it, is its ability to look at a whole, its ability to put two things together and see a whole. Now, you can understand this from a very simple analogy. If you take an old-fashioned newspaper photograph, as many of you probably did as children, you can take a magnifying glass and you can see that these are individual black dots that make up the photograph. So if you imagine being very close to the photograph, all you see are the black dots. But when you step back far enough, then you see that the individual black dots form a picture. Now, my beloved, if you take a picture of a rose, and if scientists go in and look at the black dots and analyze each and every black dot, tell me, my beloved, if they couldn't see the whole picture, could they, by looking at the individual black dots, ever construe that they make up the image of a rose? You cannot, by looking at the components, see the totality, see the whole. And that is the approach that democratic nations have so far had to serving their citizens. You are trying to look at the individual components of a human being, the material, physical components. And you can do this very well for material needs. You can look at the body and what it needs in terms of nutrition and exercise and this and that, and you can come up with a whole list of this. But when it comes to the psychological welfare, you cannot promote psychological welfare without looking at the whole, without understanding the whole of what is a human being and how does it function. And so this is something you can envision, you can make the calls for, that society will wake up and realize that the next step for democracy is to make people feel good about themselves, but we can only do this when we adopt what we might call a more holistic approach and look at human beings as more than the components of their physical brains. And so, truly, if this shift can happen, or rather when it will happen, then it opens up so many perspectives for how society can begin to redefine what is truly the goal of a democratic society. And to again tie into Saint Germain, that you have a right to be free of exploitation, well, you can see that this very tendency to approach, to look at the details and to ignore the whole, is actually something that is put upon people and put upon societies by a small elite who may not necessarily be malicious when you look at the people, but they have a very, very limited vision. But at the same time, they also have a very, very big pride and sense that they know better, because they are the intellectual elite who are able to decide that God does not exist, and therefore society should move away from any form of religion and spirituality, and society should be entirely materialistic, because that is just the way the world is. They feel they are capable of deciding on behalf of society. And so you need to look at the fact here that there has formed this intellectual power elite. And although there are other power elites who have more clandestine intentions, this power elite, on the surface, they have benign intentions. But the fact of the matter is that they are not so benign, because they are willing to ignore the well-being of all people in society in order to promote their materialistic ideology. And they don't care about the fact that people are dissatisfied, that people are becoming depressed, that there's more and more psychological problems, or that people are not feeling good about themselves. They are so fanatically promoting their materialistic idea that they don't care about human beings, because, as we have said before, the idea has become more important than the individual. And this is a very, very insidious form of exploitation. When you have an entire society that is based on an idea, and when this idea is more important than the individual, be it the physical survival of the individual or the psychological well-being of the individual, then you have an abusive, exploitative society. Then the population is being abused. Naturally, you can see societies where if the people didn't agree with a communist ideology, they would be sent to Siberia, or if they didn't agree with the Nazi ideology, they would be sent to a concentration camp. And this is a more extreme form. But my beloved, are you not realizing that most of the people in democratic nations who claim to be free and of the people, by the people, and for the people, these people are being held hostage by a small intellectual elite who are fanatically promoting the idea of materialism and ignoring the fact that this does not promote the well-being of the population. And so these people are so fanatical that they are willing to actually exploit the people, abuse the people in order to promote an ideology. And this is very abusive. And it is something that a democratic government has a responsibility to protect its citizens from. And so, when you begin to recognize this, you can see the need to rethink the way we approach society. That it is not a matter of thinking we have done wrong so far. It is a matter of realizing that the next logical step in this process of raising the collective awareness that Saint Germain described is that we step up and promote psychological welfare. And in order to do this, we of course have to understand the psychology, and in order to understand the psychology better, we have to overcome the unwillingness of materialistic science to seriously study consciousness and to seriously consider how consciousness influences not only every aspect of our individual lives, but how the collective consciousness influences society as a whole, and even explore the possibility that the collective consciousness may influence the physical material universe. And so, these are very, very important topics, because by a subtle shift in the mindset, society can be freed from the current stalemate and suddenly make leaps and bounds forward, also in the field of science, but first of all in the field of psychology, of understanding what kind of beings you are and what actually makes a person feel good about himself or herself. This can lead to so many things. But what I need you who are Ascended Master students to make calls on is to realize that behind this intellectual power elite that wants to promote materialism, and behind the other power elites that seek power or economic control, there are always forces in the three other realms. There are